If I asked you which of these two games was about exploring dungeons infested with cosmic horrors based purely on the art style, what would your guess be? I imagine everyone answered this one, and you would be completely right. But why does this distinction seem so simple? This is Darkest Dungeon, a game about facing creatures and cultists in dungeons and ruins, with a touch of Lovecraftian horror. Although it is a great game, we aren't going to talk specifically about its gameplay today, but rather how its art style perfectly communicates what it needs to say without using a single word. By analyzing the game's art, we can reach conclusions without knowing anything about it. And well, they say not to judge a book by its cover, but that's literally its goal, to sell the visual idea of that work. That is the purpose. Let's see what we can gather by observing a moment of the game. I believe the first notable thing about the style is the shadow, which unlike the usual is marked completely in black, which ends up giving an impression that even with the environment lit, it still holds shadows, secrets. This fits perfectly with a dark and mysterious game where one of the main mechanics is none other than torch lighting. The darker it gets, the more dangerous it becomes. This also occurs in the characters, but serving a different purpose, the player's detachment from the character. Darkest Dungeon is considered a difficult game, and not the typical story where a group faces all evils. It is basically mandatory that several characters will die on missions. With this in mind, the shadows, specifically in the character's eye region, makes us more distant from them, almost as if they were just tools. Or, looking from another angle, it can also be explained as the lack of hope these characters have in the dark and cold world. Another curiosity about Darkest Dungeon's art style is that it's highly inspired by the art of Mike Mignola, an author of well-known comics like Hellboy. Mignola generally writes and draws works leaning more towards the supernatural, dark fantasy and gloom, also with influence like H.P. Lovecraft. See how everything connects? Now, changing pace, another good example is Doki Doki Literature Club, but in a different way. The game follows a style closer to anime and follows the classic path of dating simulators and visual novels, where the protagonist is at school and meets potential love interests. In fact, Doki Doki ends up following a very cliché and almost generic pattern for a large part of the game. Here comes a spoiler, so if you haven't played it yet, skip to this moment of the video appearing on the screen. The style in this case doesn't communicate exactly what the game truly is, but rather is used as a tool for the plot. It sells itself as a simple, common, and almost cute dating simulator to lower your guard, making us more susceptible to the surprise of the horror implementation. This gives us an idea of how powerful the choice of visual art in a work can be. Last but not least, we have Grease, a beautiful game that deals with pain and being lost. In fact, Grease is a more abstract game that focuses on feelings. It is a game more about feeling than anything else. And what kind of visual art did they choose? Watercolor, a fluid paint that we cannot completely control. Do you see where I'm going? Speaking of paint, another important subject to take into consideration when observing the visual aspects of a game is color. Just like in a movie, colors in games are also carefully planned. Grease itself is a perfect example of how colors, alone or accompanied, tell stories. At the beginning of the game, we start in the hands of a statue, a symbol of safety, and all colors are present, until Grease loses her voice. We then start to plummet, and suddenly, we find ourselves in a completely black and white world. The only exception to the absence of color is the protagonist herself, with her hair and face. Proceeding, we eventually recover a new color, red, and soon we are thrown into a place that is basically monochromatic of this pigment. Going further, the protagonist begins to face storms of red, which are very strong winds that knocks you down and push you back. This continues to be an obstacle until, eventually, Grease learns a new skill. She learns to transform into a kind of cube. Yeah, I know, but it makes sense. Solid enough to pass through these red storms. And so the game continues, rediscovering colors and facing their peculiarities or even their absence. If you remember what I said about Grease earlier, that is a game about pain and being lost, it shouldn't be hard to understand that this is a game about loss, and we are abstractly facing the stages of grief. Taking red as an example, it becomes even easier to relate. A strong color, normally related to strong feelings, and something closer to instinct. We reach the conclusion that red here represents anger, and the storms represents outbursts of rage that can only be crossed by being firm enough. Even moments where we have no colors other than black and white have meaning, like denial or the void in Grease, but at this point I believe you've understood. But this happens even if not as clearly as in Grease. which we can see by returning once more to Darkest Dungeon, where the game's colors are usually desaturated and lifeless, giving the scenes a more morbid feel. Try to notice the colors and scenes of the games you play and moves you watch, and you will realize how much they change the mood. Often, we assume that many things in the works we consume are just by chance or because they are considered beautiful, but we end up forgetting that art is not made just to entertain, but also to unsettle, to instigate. Of course, not every game needs to have such a grand reason behind everything. Often, a style being simpler and faster to make is already enough reason to choose it. But it's good to remember, games are complete works that encompass various technical and creative areas at the same time, so it is crucial that they talk to each other. And in the end, why would I buy a book whose cover doesn't tell me an idea at all?